5.
They say he's better at foreign relations than he is at domestic ones. Well, you could have fooled me.
4.
I got my banana sling on in Martin Croxall and Penny Smith's honour.
3.
There was a slight sort of frisson of BBC presenter says something most of nation agrees with shock.
2.
It hasn't had much press coverage, which is shocking to me and to my colleagues. We just don't understand how this is getting through under the radar.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Allison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. On Monday night, Donald Trump declared an agreed ceasefire between Israel and Iran. By the time he woke up on Tuesday, both nations had violated it, causing a clearly furious US president to unleash some pretty industrial language. As we record Planet Normal, a fragile ceasefire is back in place, and Trump's retreated from his threats of imposing regime change on Tehran, hopefully putting an end to the horrific exchanges of air attacks and missile strikes between Israel and Iran. Oil prices have certainly plunged, even though Iran's parliament voted to block the Straits of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, as investors bet that this vital energy route will now remain open. Back in the UK, as Labour grapples with the US president, the party's in a war of its own on the government's welfare bill. Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall and Downing Street, for now, are quotes determined to push the bill through, emphasising the need to slow down the increase in welfare spending by £5 billion a year by 2030. The government has a massive working majority of 165 in the Commons, Allison, so would lose the vote if 83 Labour MPs rebelled, assuming opposition parties unite against it. There's plenty of behind-the-scenes arm-twisting going on and briefing of newspapers before voting begins in early July. But let's start, Allison, with the subject of your column in Wednesday's Telegraph, link in the show notes to this episode. Both you and Reform Deputy Leader Richard Tice MP are extremely concerned about how Lucy Connelly, a mum jailed for 31 months for a tweet she soon deleted, is being treated while in prison. It's a pretty sordid tale, and one which I know has really disturbed you. What can you tell us?
Before we plunge into that darkness, I just want to tell you that I was watching Look East, our local news, and they were getting very worried about this yellow health alert, which on closer examination, Halligan, turned out to be summer. So watch out. This yellow health stuff. And we're also having predictions of hell heat, 34 degrees.
The BBC's climate change editor had obviously sent a signal on the bat phone. Woo, woo, woo. The sun's out. Sun's out.
Justin Rowlatt always combing the continent. You know, he's always trying to sort of shimmy down Mount Vesuvius, isn't he, Justin?
That makes him the sunny freebie correspondent, doesn't it? Travelling around Europe's sunspots at the taxpayer's expense.
Yeah, he absolutely is. But I actually posted on X that some of us are old enough to remember the summer of 1976.
We had joy, we had fun, we had seasons, and nothing that a squirt of Timothy White's sun cream couldn't solve.
I think we just burn in our household. I don't think we splashed out on any ambre solaire, not in South Wales.
One splashed out on Brute in the 70s.
Yeah, I did my big exams in the summer, and I remember all the lawns were crusty brown, and the tar macadam pavements outside our house melted. And all the street lights, they dipped, Halligan, like wading birds. I mean,
Wow.
that was hot. And that went on really, for weeks and weeks and weeks. So,
And your little size 3s in your Dunlop Amber Flash got stuck in the pavement. You couldn't move.
exactly. You were there. And also, just before we move on, I thought my person of the week for Planet Normal has got to go to Martin Croxall, the BBC newsreader, who was given an item to read about all the people who were going to be affected by the yellow health alert, aka summer. And Martin Croxall said pregnant people and then said women and then moved on.
With a whimsical eye roll. I got form with Martin Croxall. Martin Croxall used to host paper reviews on the BBC with myself and the wonderful Penny Smith. She of Good Morning Britain fame, and we once did an item. It was the end of Penny and my partnership. I think the BBC banned us. We did an item, the three of us, on the fashion for banana slings. Now, if you don't know what a banana sling is, it's like a very, 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 very scant pair of budgie smugglers. It's not even a pair because it just goes around one leg.
Oh, no. We'll just share with listeners that you're actually calling in from Valencia. So God knows what you've got on.
I've got my banana sling on in Martin Croxall and Penny Smith's honour. You are my ultimate media belle, Allison. But, you know, my eyes have been averted in the past, and we had great fun, the three of us, doing BBC paper reviews that had the boss class quaking in their chinos.
Well, it was interesting, wasn't it? Because J.K. Rowling gave Martin Croxall a bit of a shout out. And I did think, you know, there was a slight sort of frisson of BBC presenter says something most of nation agrees with shock.
Yeah, I hope Martin gets her own chat show off the back of it. She deserves it. She's long been a kind of very, very admirably normal person in an organisation that doesn't really like normal people with normal views very much. Certainly not if they're on air, in my experience. And good on her. I hope she goes on to greater things. She's actually a very good journalist, and she's a really good TV presenting talent. And here's to you, Martine.
Well, coming back to my week, which has been pretty tumultuous. Listeners will know I've been very steeped in the Lucy Connelly case. Lucy, who was jailed for an exorbitant 31 months for a pretty nasty social media tweet, which she deleted within a few hours, and nevertheless was part of the group of people who posted on social media around the Southport massacre, who the authorities came down on like a ton of bricks. So I'm in close touch with Ray, Lucy's husband, and Ray told me on Friday, Liam, that Lucy had a horrible incident on Thursday. Now, she's moved from prison Drake Hall in Staffordshire to Peterborough Jail, and the reason she did that is because, of course, they're not going to let her out for any of this day release leave, to which she has been fully entitled since November, because she's treated as a public example. You know, they don't want her coming out for all sorts of reasons. And she returned to Peterborough, where she'd been perfectly happy in the initial stages of her sentencing, made good friends with many of the women and with some of the prison officers, was highly regarded and liked. And I should say, Liam, that when she was jailed, brought to Peterborough, a couple of the prison officers said to her after a few weeks, "Oh, you're nothing like we were told, Lucy." And Lucy said, "What do you mean?" And they said they'd been informed by the police that Lucy was a very dangerous and violent woman. So that's part of the propaganda that's followed her around quite shamefully. So on Thursday, she was expecting to move from the induction unit where she was into enhanced accommodation, and she's entitled to slightly better accommodation because her behaviour in jail has been exemplary, and she could see her name up on the board, Lucy Connelly, next to the wing where they were going to be finding her pleasant room this week, probably on Tuesday just gone. Then on Thursday, suddenly an officer shocked her by saying, "You're going up to this A1 wing." Now, Liam, this is basically the wing for the worst of the worst. It's known as the Bronx. It's known as the zoo. It's lots of women. I don't even know what spice is, but there's spice heads up there, smack heads, child sexual abusers, all sorts of, it's lots of fights, lots of violence. So Lucy was quite understandably shocked and upset. And she said to the officer, "Why? What's going on? Why would you put me up there?" There were also rumours, I have to say, that she would be put in a cell that had been occupied by a woman who had died 3 days previously. So deeply unpleasant stuff. Attempt to play mind games with her, we could speculate. So she said, "I'm not going. I want an explanation." And then very shortly after, she was essentially jumped by 5 or 6 prison officers who got her into a sort of bent over restraining hold, which I'm told is absolutely excruciating. She was crying uncontrollably. She had her arms bent behind her and handcuffed very, very tightly, really tightly. And they dragged her, Liam, up 3 flights of stairs to this room, a really disgusting room, which looked like the walls were covered in excrement, but they claimed it was coffee. Lucy thought it was excrement. And she lay on the floor crying with shock. They also told her, just to add to the picture, that she was going to be on basics, which means any privileges have been removed. She was going to be 23 hours a day in this cell, absolutely boiling cell, no curtains, no nothing, no telly, no nothing. And she wouldn't be allowed even to leave the cell to go and have her meals in the canteen. So very upsetting, shocking events. And to this very, very nice, generally decent person. And Ray was, her husband was incredibly upset. So what I did was I texted a few people. I told Richard Tice, as you say, Deputy Leader of Reform, I said, I'm very worried about Lucy. This really clearly quite horrible, intimidating stuff is happening to her. And Richard, to his great credit, said, right, I'm going to go and visit her. And he was as good as his word. And he did indeed visit her this week.
And MPs have visiting rights in all prisons at all times, don't they?
Yes, I was surprised to discover that, but it seems that they have a right to go in. They wouldn't let me in, of course, being the dreaded media publicising Lucy's case, which they don't want. They'd rather it was all top secret. But Richard went in and had a very, very good chat with her. He said Lucy was calm and impressive, but with clear, very, very bad bruises on her arms and wrists where she'd been restrained. So Richard was able to engage with the head of security in the prison, who will now be reviewing the body cam footage. On a solicitor, in fact, who represented me, Luke Gittos, for the Free Speech Union, is sending a very stern letter today, that's Wednesday, to the governor at Peterborough. And basically, Liam, we're keeping a very close eye because Lucy is due out in about 8 weeks' time. August 21st is the date of her release. And quite honestly, the conclusion that Richard Tice came to, which is the conclusion I've come to, is they will do anything to provoke her to be violent or difficult so that they can come up with some excuse to keep her in. And listeners will remember the chilling phrase that Lucy said to me, Allison, I think they'd keep me inside for 100 years if they could.
Crikey, this is really quite serious. So what was Richard's final conclusion about Lucy's situation? You say he concluded that she was being deliberately targeted in some way. Did the prison authorities have anything to say about that?
Well, so far, he's just complained to the head of security. In fact, yesterday, the podcast is going, we're recording on Wednesday. So as we're recording now, Liam, at this exact moment, Richard is up on his feet in the House of Commons, presenting a 10-minute rule bill, which is he's calling Lucy's Law. And what he's proposing is that anyone who gets a sentence which 500 or more members of the general public considers to be far too extreme can register, sign a petition, and that sentence will then be referred to a sort of criminal sentencing board and will be re-examined. And meanwhile, that person will not be bunged into jail, which is what happened to Lucy Connelly. And that's where it all started to unravel for Lucy, because the minute, as you'll remember, Liam, the minute that she was on remand in jail, clearly terrified, she agreed to plead guilty. She should never have pleaded guilty. If any listeners ever get into any trouble, take it from your Auntie Allison. Say nothing and refuse to plead guilty. So yes, Richard Tice is proposing that bill today. Obviously, it won't get any traction in the current Labour-dominated House of Commons. But I think he's making a very important moral stand here. We can see that Lucy and many others are the victims of two-tier justice, which I think is a real scandal in our nation. So I think the plan is that Richard is waiting for the head of security to review the body cam footage worn by the prison officers. And then, as he said, if there's any nonsense about, we've lost the footage, he will then go back, redouble his efforts. I have to say, Liam, and I found this quite, this is when we think this is our country, right? Richard said he thought the next 6 weeks were going to be a very challenging time for Lucy, and he'd warned her to look out for them trying to plant drugs on her. Now, can you imagine that?
Crikey, because they want to portray her as a wrong 'un in some way in order to justify their treatment as she sees it. I tell you what I'd like to see, Alison, just as after your horrific experience when it comes to non-crime hate incidents, when Essex police disgracefully, in my view, turned up at your door Remembrance Sunday morning with regard to a year-old tweet, which they wouldn't tell you the precise tweet. We had, after that, and you writing about it and us talking about it here on Planet Normal, we had a slew of correspondence from people both serving police officers and former police officers, many of them very, very senior, throwing in their two penneth, and we read out some of those emails. I'd really like to hear from some active and previous lawyers what they think of Richard Tice's idea in order to have a bill that allows the public to protest when they think a sentence has been overdone, or maybe even when a sentence has been underdone as well. Because you and I have often discussed the dangers on the one hand of the judiciary being questioned, but also the by political types, but the dangers, and the general public, but the dangers of the judiciary not being questioned as well. And so it strikes me this is an interesting moment. Just give us an update. You are absolutely steeped in this case. It's affected you very, very deeply. We've talked about it a lot offline. It has really, the piece you've written in the Telegraph on Wednesday, again, link in the show notes to this episode, is going like the clappers, thousands and thousands of comments. You've clearly touched a nerve. What's the prognosis now for Lucy's release date, or would it be prejudicial in some sense for you to even speculate about that, given that you are now a central figure in this case?
Well, she will on August 21st have served 40% of her sentence. And as we know, Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, recently announced that essentially very, very violent people, including rapists, to empty the prisons. Our prisons are too full. So they're going to be allowed out, those violent men, including child abusers and rapists, with an even bigger reduction in their sentence than Lucy. So I can see no reason why she wouldn't be released on August the 21st. Obviously, I will be the first person to speak to her as a journalist, Liam, and I'll be obviously be bringing Lucy to the beloved citizens of Planet Normal. And I know they're going to be really impressed with her. And she has, I'm delighted to say, expressed a wish to work in penal reform, because she says the things she said, and Richard Tice said to me, having spoken to her for an hour, he said, my God, she couldn't just write a book, she could run a prison. And I felt actually, well, apart from anything else, I was very tearful because Richard had just left Lucy. I sort of feel I know her, but I've never met her. And the idea of Richard sitting there in his nice suit, looking all smart and so on, and sitting there with Lucy, who I know will have done her best to look nice. But I found that very, very moving. Can I just say, Liam, that even just since the piece went on live on the Telegraph site last night, lots and lots of prison officers have been getting in touch to say that Lucy's treatment is absolutely appalling. Here's a gentleman here. There's absolutely no way a prisoner would go from enhanced accommodation to basic without a severe misdemeanor, which would involve a governor's report, punishment. All that would have to be strictly documented. Even if someone was moved to a wing not of their choosing, their status, i.e. enhanced, as in Lucy's case, would go with them. There are certainly grounds.
So that suggests, I'm sure Peterborough Prison would deny this, but that suggests procedure has been overturned here. There doesn't seem to have been procedure.
Allegedly, yes. And this guy's saying there are grounds for demanding a clear explanation why Lucy has been demoted to basic. There is definitely potentially disciplinary action against the officer or officers who made that decision, and a reason to report it also to the police. So we will look forward, Liam, to finding out who authorised this really ferocious, apparently the rules governing that kind of extreme physical intervention on a person. Apparently, Lucy said to Ray she was in excruciating pain. You're bent back double, and certainly the handcuffs were on so tight that they really struggled to get them off. So she has livid black and yellow and blue rings around her wrist. This is a lady who I don't think should be in prison at all, being treated as if she's some kind of knife criminal. And just to end, Liam, listeners will know that Lucy and Ray lost their baby Harry to extreme medical negligence in 2011 when he was 19 months old, and a deeply traumatic incident for the Connellys, which they live with every day. And one thing is, Ray said to me, they're trying to break Lucy, Allison, but they won't break her because Harry's death broke her, so she can't be broken anymore. And so Harry, the dead child, I think is a talisman to his mother. They're not going to break her because her heart was broken already. And the other thing Ray said to me was he said he hadn't cried since Harry's death. He said, I didn't think I was capable of crying. But when Lucy was telling me down the phone, sobbing what they'd done to her, he said, I put my hand up to my eyes and I felt tears.
Well, it's an astonishing situation, Allison, and I know it has really impacted you. All listeners can hear that. All Telegraph readers who read your very, very powerful piece currently on the website will sense that too. And I guess it's a case of watch this space over the summer in terms of what happens next, in terms of Lucy's, as we would see it, expected release in not too many months' time. We focused on this case in this edition of Planet Normal, but there's been a huge amount going on in the world, not least in the Middle East. It seems like a ridiculous segue, but there we are. Donald Trump, of course, announced a ceasefire. The ceasefire was violated immediately by both sides in the Israeli-Iranian dispute. Lots of exchanges of missile strikes and so on. It seems now, as we speak, we've got a fragile ceasefire. A ceasefire, of course, is not peace by any means, but a fragile ceasefire. Certainly, the canny folk in the financial markets who often know more than the politicians, they often know what the intelligence services know and more, by the way, particularly in an area like the Middle East. They have traded the price of oil down. I use that not in a kind of, look, the economy is going to do better sense, but in just a sense of, the likelihood of this ceasefire to actually stick. And I certainly hope that it does. But what did you think with Donald Trump's very industrial language? Because that's certainly going to go down as a sort of Trivial Pursuit moment, wasn't it? Who was the first US, just like Johnny Lydon was the first TV personality to drop the F-bomb on live British television. He beat Bob Geldof by a couple of years. Who was the first US president to do so? I mean, I thought it was quite clever because I thought he will have deliberately shocked a lot of the bien-pensants. Not that I would endorse such language on primetime television, but I think a lot of ordinary folk around the world would have thought, he's right. We're sick of this.
Well, I take a slightly different view, Liam, because I think any damage done to the Islamic Republican Guard is for the benefit of civilization and for the benefit of humanity. I was very glad that the astonishing bunker buster bombs, America was able to go in and target these 3 nuclear sites in Iran where they're making enough enriched uranium to produce a nuclear bomb, and a nuclear bomb in the hands of that regime is extremely terrifying. As Matthew Saeed, the very excellent commentator, pointed out this week, that the thing about nuclear weapons is they're supposed to act as a deterrent. But if you've got a sort of fundamentalist religious regime, which you have under Ayatollah Khamenei, they're not going to really be deterred by the idea of mutually assured destruction is perfectly fine if you're one of those nutters. So I was very pleased that the United States helping Israel had taken that action. And I was actually hoping against hope, perhaps, that there would be regime change, because it's the most wicked, horrifying place to live, especially if you're a woman or a girl. They've hanged enormous numbers of women and girls in the last few years just for showing their hair. We've got time for a Velma stat, because we haven't had one of those for a while.
Hey, Scooby-Doo! See, Scooby's back.
Yeah, just to say, our Prime Minister has been absolutely, and they say he's better at foreign relations than he is at domestic ones. Well, you could have fooled me. I mean, this absolute refusal by Starmer and all the cabinet to say whether they think the US action against Iran was legal just looks like absolutely humiliating and embarrassing as a, morally, diplomatically, politically bankrupt stance taken by our Prime Minister, who in any sphere of activity seems to put the domestic vote abacus above British interests. So that's basically doesn't want to say bombing Iran's a fantastic idea because you might lose a few Muslim votes. But just to tell listeners what's at stake here. So the Director General of MI5 said not long ago that since the start of 2022, the UK has responded to 20 Iranian-backed plots posing potentially lethal threats to British citizens. So when we wonder what's that got to do with us, that's what it's got to do with us, Liam. Almost all Islamist-inspired terrorist plots in our country have been backed by Iran. And this week, at long last, we've seen the government emerge from its coma to ban Palestine Action, members of which went to vandalise planes at Brize Norton. So Iran, it's not just a lethal threat to Israel, to whose extermination Iran is dedicated, but the US is the great Satan for the Ayatollahs, and Britain and Israel are little Satan. So good riddance to them is what I say.
So Zara Sultana, of course, a Coventry MP, a left-wing Labour MP, very, very, very provocatively tweeted, "We are all Palestine Action." So she's basically endorsing, there's a government MP who's endorsing a group that, goes around attacking the RAF and so on. It's a bit strong, to say the least, co-pilot. And, can Keir Starmer really let that stand?
Well, his problems are really piling up, aren't they, Liam? Because, as you said at the top, we've now got this major Labour rebellion hoving into view. Over 100 Labour MPs have signed this reasoned amendment to the welfare reform bill. There's going to be a vote next Tuesday. Now, apparently, at first, Labour was saying this isn't a vote of confidence in Keir Starmer, but I understand that the whips are now ringing around MPs to tell them that the bill will be treated as a confidence vote. You'll obviously know much more about this than I do, Liam, but it strikes me that we're seeing from this government, just a few weeks after the U-turn on the winter fuel payment, now facing this backbench rebellion, it seems to be very, very hard to make any cuts in public services at all.
It does indeed. So what we're going to see on the 1st of July is what we call the second reading. That's the first vote in the Commons. The first reading is when a bill is just published. It will be the first of many votes on this legislation. It will go to the Lords, then back to the Commons. And so even if the bill gets through on second reading with fewer than 83 Labour MPs rebelling, and the role of the Tories in this will be crucial. I mean, the Lib Dems will obviously vote against the welfare reform bill because they're against all reductions in public spending by definition. It's just how they are. The Tories, of course, they're saying that we need welfare reform. We need to spend, we're not spending less on welfare. This is about slowing down the rate of growth of welfare. We're already set to see the welfare bill increase by tens of billions of pounds over the lifetime of this Parliament. Just welfare spending on sickness and disability related benefits is going up from around 55 to around 80 billion in this Parliament. What this bill will do in its most, determined form is it will slow down that increase by 5 billion, but it's still a massive increase. And now Labour's probably going to retreat from that. There have already been quite a few concessions made. It seems that Rachel Reeves, Liz Kendall and Wes Streeting are the only members really on the government front bench who wedded to these reforms, who are more the sort of from the Blairite wing of the party. Because, of course, this rebellion really is being coordinated not by a feisty backbencher, it's being coordinated by the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who sees it as a badge of honour. She wants the Labour movement, the activists, the backbench MPs to see that she calls the shots, she can control the Prime Minister. Starmer's saying meekly for now that they are going to make these savings. He's going to hang out Liz Kendall, who's a decent person, one of the few people on the Labour front bench, in my experience, who can actually add up and has a responsible approach to the public finances. She's unfortunately going to be hung out to dry. Wes Streeting will probably fold. A lot of these savings that Labour say will be made and are baked into the public finances won't be made. The gilts market will take note. They'll push up the price of government borrowing even more. It will all be added to the interest bill and make it harder and harder for us to escape this kind of, high debt, low growth, high borrowing doom loop that we're all in. And that's the top and bottom of it. That's how I see it happening, and there's just no grit in this Labour government. The slightest, contact with reality, their plans fold. They just cave in like student politicians.
We absolutely have to get a grip on this. I mean, I know we keep saying, you explain it brilliantly, Liam, on Planet Normal, but I was just looking at some of these figures. So
I was just looking at some of these figures, says Alison Pearson. I've got a spreadsheet. You thought a spreadsheet was something that you put in the bed in the guest room or something, didn't you?
No, it's something. It's Baker Glide. It's a Baker Glide for me, mate.
I like a bit of Baker Glide.
I love a bit of Baker Glide. But so let's have a look at this. So these, as you say, Liz Kendall, really, I think, excellent minister, talking about just trying to chip away at these personal independent payments known as PIP. So the changes in eligibility, which she's putting forward, would mean that 800,000 people would be likely to lose some money. So there are squeals of horror, all the news programmes wheeling out people claiming they won't be able to get into a wheelchair and so on. But let's have a look at this, Liam. So as of January this year, 3.7 million people were claiming PIP. Now, some of these people are in work. A lot of them are in work. And that was an increase of 2% just from October 2024. Now, if you dig down, it's absolutely astonishing. So there's been a huge rise in PIP payments for people with ADHD. So in 2023, 52,989 claimants with ADHD got PIP payments. That's the personal independence payments. Not entirely sure. I know quite a few people with ADHD. Not entirely sure. These PIP payments are supposed to be for people who need help with washing and showering and, all the people we know who actually need these payments. And ADHD is one of the higher conditions now on the more disabling conditions that's listed on those qualified for PIP. I mean, this country is just a joke. And, looking again at the 9% increase between February 2023 and February 2024 in people claiming disability or incapacity benefit, with mental health conditions now being one of the biggest factors. And here's a stonking stat for you, Liam. 41% of recent disability claimants cited mental health as their primary condition. And let me just say, I've suffered from depression. I don't underestimate what it's like when you've got clinical depression, but we cannot have millions of people in our country claiming billions and billions of pounds. Never mind the beneficial effect for people with mental health issues of being in work. There's nothing like regularity and company and getting out of the house that's good for you. But I just, as you say, Liam, I'm just look at these figures and think, what are we going to be? Are we going to be a smaller and smaller economy? There'll be fewer and fewer of us paying income tax to drag this vast load of people claiming they need stuff for ADHD. In every sense, it's mental and it has to stop.
I'm just going to do our now regular feature, the Planet Normal guilt yield check. See, what other podcast on the market goes from Mary Berry Baker Glide? I didn't know what Baker Glide was for many years. It's stuff that posh people put under their meat when they stick it in an oven, right? Usually an Arga.
Well, I think your guilt markets check is very much the soggy bottom of the economy. Ooh, off you go.
Here we go. So just as a reminder, back at the height of the Liz Truss mini-budget crisis, the government was paying 4.85% for 30-year money. So 4.85% a year to borrow money for 30 years off the big investment companies, the insurance companies, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, right? Under Labour, us Labours, that gilt yield has been above 5%. So it was 4.85 when, the world fell to pieces, according to the establishment under Liz Truss. It's been above 5% since basically the start of December. Yeah. So throughout most of December, then for the whole of 2025, that gilt yield has been above 5%. And at times it's got to, above 5.5%. It's currently 5.3%. Now, those yields have gone up around the world, that's true. But the UK has a situation because a big chunk of our gilts are linked to inflation, not just to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, but to the RPI, the Retail Price Index, which is even higher, which means as inflation gets going, our debt interest bill, already well north of £100 billion a year, getting on for twice what we spend on defence, more than we spend on education and transport combined, is going to spiral upwards. So we are very, very vulnerable here. And the more Labour funks these decisions, the more Labour caves in to its own backbenches, rather than saying to them, look, this is the real world. Do you want to be in office for more than one term or not? Then the more the gilt market will push that rate up. That means more expensive government borrowing. That means more and more taxpayers' money and more borrowing spent on debt service. And you get into a downward spiral, as anyone who thinks about it for more than 10 seconds will agree. I'm increasingly of the view, Allison, that this government, they're basically going to go for a scorched earth policy now.
Yeah,
they're basically
I agree.
thinking, look, we are so unpopular, we don't care, we're just going to do all the really hard left Labour things that we want to do before you chuck us out. Well, we're going to come on to this later in the show, the so-called employment rights bill, which will actually mean less rights for employees in many senses, because they won't be employed, they won't have jobs, unfortunately. But that's where I think a lot of this Labour front bench now are. I talk to a lot of these people privately. I've known many of them for a long time, and with just one or two or three exceptions that we've mentioned, and I do think Rachel Reeves is one of them, though she caves in far too quickly, and she's naive in the ways of the press and the black arts of politics, if you like, again, in my experience. I just don't think they care. They just think they're right. They're going to keep jacking up tax rates, even though as they jack up tax rates, the amount of actual tax revenue goes down. We said several editions ago on Planet Normal, the economy's a Laffer curve a minute, didn't we? Because the Laffer curve is the idea that the more you jack up tax rates above a certain level, the less actual tax revenue you get, because, you know, enterprise stops. And we are now very near that point.
I can't remember a time in my lifetime when just casually talking to so many people and they will raise, where could we go? Where could we move to? I just can't remember that phenomenon. We have had this forecast this week, up to 16,500 millionaires leaving the UK this year, following a lot more. And I think 12 billionaires last year, taking absolutely vast amounts of tax with them. And whose example should they be following, Halligan? Let us point to Argentina and my boyfriend, Mr. Millet.
You love a man with a chainsaw.
What I really like is I like the 1970s hair. That's what I feel really nostalgic for that.
And a good steak.
He literally looks like he's been dragged through a hedge backwards with his chainsaw. So Argentina, after this massive cuts by Mr. Millet, not scared like Rachel Reeves of popular pushback. Annual GDP growth, Argentina, 5.8%.
Outstripping China, no less.
Outstripping China, the highest in the Western world and higher than China. Now, that does show, do we have to get to sort of Argentina, sell the clothes off your backs, dire straits before anyone's going to have the nerve to do something like that?
This week's guest is Baroness Cash, a barrister turned Tory peer spearheading attempts in the House of Lords to rein in the government's Employment Rights Bill. Hailed by Labour as the biggest upgrade in employment rights for a generation, a core part of the mission to grow the economy, this legislation introduces a raft of new rules and regulations that boost trade union power and could take Britain back to the dystopian industrial relations of the 1970s. Championed by Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, the measures make it much more burdensome to employ workers at a time when employment's already falling sharply and will leave businesses vulnerable to ruinous strikes. Labour wants lower voting thresholds for strike action, an end to flexible zero-hour contracts, and wants to grant rights to unfair dismissal, sick pay and paternity rights from day one of employment. The bill also seeks to make union funding of the Labour Party automatic, with unions able to take companies to employment tribunals even if employees don't want to sue. This bill's led to tensions in the cabinet, with Chancellor Rachel Reeves trying to dilute the measures as she desperately tries to get the economy moving. Tory Business Secretary Andrew Griffith has written to countless business leaders urging them to fight the legislation, accusing Rayner of taking a wrecking ball to the economy. And in the Lords, Tory opposition has been led by Baroness Cash, who grew up in Northern Ireland and Oxford-educated daughter of a newsagent, called to the bar in 1994. Welcoming Joanne to Planet Normal, I started by observing that Labour's Employment Rights Bill seems to have so far attracted far too little press coverage.
It hasn't had much press coverage, which is shocking to me and to my colleagues. We just don't understand how this is getting through under the radar. Angela Rayner's on record as saying she wants to repeal all the union laws since the 70s, to take us back to the 70s. And Liam, you and I are just old enough to remember that. That was Birmingham writ large. Everything came to a standstill and brought the country to its knees economically. So yeah, I'm really shocked there's not enough coverage of it.
Just give us a kind of courtroom summary of the legislation, Joanne, and then we'll drill down into some of the detail. What are the big headlines? What are the big aspects of the bill that worry you?
I would say the biggest headline for me in context of going back in time is removing the thresholds for a strike. So for any listeners who don't know how it works, at the moment, a union has to have a recognised bargaining unit, they call it, but it's a group of employees who qualify to vote on a strike. And so that might be John Lewis in London wants to strike. That might be that particular department store. They have a threshold currently of 50% to have to vote to participate in that.
So 50% of the workforce have to agree to a strike before there's a strike?
Look, 50% of that bargaining unit, yes, of that workforce, as identified. That's being removed, and it will be a simple majority. So if only two people in that bargaining unit wanted to vote, or three people, you could have two people voting for a strike. We could be bringing businesses and the country to its knees with tiny minorities of people. If you then add to that the fact that there is no exemption, and despite our best efforts, Tory MPs in the Commons and now peers in the Lords have been putting down amendments saying exempt small and medium-sized businesses from all of this at least. We're seeing not a chink in the thinking on the front benches. So they're planning to do this to very tiny businesses. I mean, Liam, you know as well as I do, that 60% of our workforce is employed by micro and small businesses. We're a nation of entrepreneurs. The old saying that we were a nation of shopkeepers, but those shopkeepers are now little online businesses, they're influencers who run a small team, podcasters. The world has changed. We have so many people running their life like that and employing people. You can end up in a situation where a small business, take the business that I've run, where we had 250 employees. If that was a unionized business, you could have a handful of people bringing the whole thing to a standstill. So it is really shocking. That's one thing. Okay. Then you get onto the change the Conservatives made when in power was to take what used to be an opt-out. So if you sign up to something online and then you have to say, do you want insurance to go with your flight? You tick no. That's an opt-in. So you're told from the beginning, do you want it or do you not want it? If you book that flight and you've paid secretly for the insurance, that's where you have to opt out. So you're paying to your trade union membership, and you then have to be told within 8 weeks that you've actually also subscribed to the political fund. Some unions in this country give from their political fund directly to the Labour Party. Now, it's 8 weeks notice that they're allowed to give the employees to come out of that. Then they have another month before they have to remove it from a pay cycle. So you could have 3 months subscription to your political fund, which is going straight to the Labour Party coffers before any of that is cancelled, which, by the way, I think happens to be a breach of Article 11, where you're not obliged to be associated with any political organisation you don't want to be associated with.
That's Article 11 of the ECHR.
Human Rights Act, as it now is, that the Labour Party is very fond of upholding, and they themselves are quite happy to go ahead with this.
So this is basically a way for the Labour Party to plant in employment legislation the ability of trade unions to take money unwittingly off ordinary people that then goes to the Labour Party coffers.
But Liam, worse than that, they're very open about it. I mean, in the debate in the House of Lords the other night on this, we had a number of peers on the Labour benches standing up and saying, since the opt-in was introduced, our funds have declined, and there's no question this is about raising additional funds. So it's not a secret. It's just, to me, this is the enigma of why this isn't being more broadly covered. And as Baroness Fox said, Claire Fox stood up and said, how can you even claim to be the party of the working people anymore, taking subscriptions, fundraising in this way, when Reform are sitting at 25%, and there are two other political parties here. But it's all just being dismissed. The majority that they have in the Commons is such that there is no debate, no dissent, no conversation. We're all in a very, very slow, painful car crash here.
I know another thing that worries you as a lawyer, Joanne, that we've discussed is that there's an awful lot of power being given to trade unions to seize evidence, carry on legal cases against employers, even when the relevant employees have decided not to carry on with the case.
Yes, and I sat through the debate where we were asking for some simple safeguards against intimidation for employees. You know, the idea that union reps can show up, seize documents. And let's remember, again, these could be very small businesses. We're not talking about the big corporates only. We're talking about tiny businesses which don't have the funds to defend themselves at every turnaround. It could be completely disrupted.
In effect, they're just going to cave, aren't they, and give employees who are being highly litigious or unions money to just go away, right?
Yes. And, you know, the other thing is with the introduction of what's called the Fair Work Agency.
Another quango
hidden in here. With the Fair Work Agency, we're going to have unions having the power to pursue litigation against employers, even where an employee hasn't. So they become litigious in their own right. So the days of the union being there to support someone who had a legitimate case against an employer is moving to, we, the union, see lots of legal points we'd like to pursue to continually push the boundaries here and make life difficult for employers.
And exert political influence over employers, let's be clear.
And exert political influence. And by the way, those political funds that I was talking about, you know, they run campaigns on all sorts of political issues. And if you look at it, why should an employee who's joined a union for a simple reason of, you know, taking some benefits with it, get some representation if they need it, and suddenly they find they're contributing to, you know, critical race theory programs, LGBTQ plus programs, things that, in my view, at least, have no place in a workplace. The
big headline, I think, from the bill that has kind of punched through, but not really, is, Joanne, it strikes me, this idea of unfair dismissal rights from day one, maternity leave rights from day one. Just talk us through the current situation and the situation as will be when this bill becomes law.
Okay, so at the moment, as we all know, there's a probation period when you employ someone or when you start a new job. And that actually works quite well for both parties.
That's usually 6 months, a year?
Well, it can depend on the employer. Legally, you can't bring a claim for unfair dismissal before 2 years. There have been amendments put down conceding that we could shorten that to, you know, a year to make it less long. But the idea that from day one, you walk into a workplace and you have day one rights for unfair dismissal, I mean, regardless of behavior, you can get tied up in employment tribunals. And small, medium businesses can't afford this. I mean, the cost of tribunals, also the wait for tribunals. So you may, as an employer, have a cast iron case, but you've got a 2-year wait with this litigation hanging over your HR department. And let's not forget that those departments are full of ordinary people who just don't need to be dealing with that level of work stress. So all of this is going to create much more conflict in the workplace. And, you know, the business I ran, Liam, is a behavioral science business. And the idea that we're introducing more conflict into workplaces is just an extraordinary retro thing to do.
So a scenario is that a small business, a kind of mum and pop business, as you say, the businesses that make up the backbone of the British economy, employ 2/3 of people in this country, generate 50% of GDP. We're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises. They could take someone on in good faith and instantly that person, and we're not talking about most employees, but there will be some employees, they'll just go on some fishing expedition, turn around, claim unfair dismissal for the most innocuous thing, or some kind of harassment case for the most innocuous thing, and then try and take the small firm for as much money as they can, knowing that the small firm won't have the headspace, won't have the HR department, won't have the legal backing in order to contest.
Yeah, absolutely. But also what's really, really terrible about this is that the government has said they want growth. They've said they want to get people off sickness benefits. And yet here they are disincentivizing employers who might otherwise take a risk on someone. So, presented an interview with someone who's got nothing on their CV for the last year. They say, what's wrong? They say, well, I've been a bit unwell. I've been off with a mental breakdown, or I've, got done for my TV license. I've done a few weeks in prison. They're not going to take a chance on that person reintegrating into the workplace. I mean, despite the fact Edward Timpson himself, one of their own ministers, has run...
Who, of course, is the guy from Timpson's who take on prisoners famously. That's the key-cutting, shoe-mending firm that you see in so many British high streets.
Absolutely. And, they say one thing and then they do another.
We've got Liz Kendall, of course, the welfare secretary. She's determined to get people back to work. How is this going to help people get back to work?
So you are nail on the head with this, okay? Why would I, as an employer, consider taking a risk with someone if I'm going to be over a barrel from day one? I would want to know I've still got my safety net over a probationary period to see if the person can adjust to the workplace, whether they're going to cope, whether they're going to need, to be off every 5 seconds, etc. This just doesn't make any sense. Not only do the numbers not add up, but the psychology, the practical implications of it are crazy.
For me, as the second most important economist on Planet Normal, because of course Alison Pearson's the most important economist on Planet Normal, as you and other regular listeners know, Joanne, look at the employment numbers. In May alone, the number of people on payroll across the economy fell by 109,000 people in 1 month alone. And since the employer national insurance increase in April, but since that October announcement, employment has fallen every single month since then, most sharply in May after it was actually implemented. But just news it was coming was enough for firms to start laying people off. Now we've got this on top of it.
Yeah, because where you would have taken the risk and pushed the budget a little bit, you just can't because the extra cost is so much.
And Liz Kendall's saying, who I think is a decent person trying to do a difficult job, the welfare secretary, she's saying how important it is to get people back to work, not only to try and rein in our runaway welfare budget, but in terms of getting growth going in a much more broader context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she's completely right about sickness benefits. We've got 1 million people on longer term sickness benefits, and that's just the mental health notes being written willy-nilly. To get those people back to work, we need a really strong strategy to support employers to take a risk on them. There's so much about this is wrong. And if you think also about what they've done to farmers already, and then part of this bill, I mean, there's so many parts of it, but for today's purposes, before we run out of time, which is that guaranteed hours. And I don't know if you've looked at this, but employers need seasonal workers. So Christmas time in shops, crop collection in farming. But what they're now saying is after a certain number of weeks, if you work for a certain number of weeks at a level of hours, the employer then has to carry on guaranteeing that number of hours. How can businesses possibly plan around seasonal demand? If you're an ice cream shop at the seaside and you're busy months, mean you then have to guarantee those staff the same hours through the winter, you go under. So there hasn't been any logic or any practicality in this. It's a very union-driven, theoretical bill that is defending the rights of actually a mythical employee, because it also doesn't factor in the freedom that people like to have, students who want to work in the holiday season and so on. It worries me enormously, Liam, and getting people off sickness benefits has to be a priority for this country because the billions it costs us annually isn't sustainable without doubt.
You're, as it were, Joanne, I wouldn't say you're on the political front line, but you're on the front line in terms of lawmaking in the Lords. An awful lot of very important discussion goes on in the Lords. And the Lords, I think, in my experience, for the most part, is full of very smart people who bring real expertise to bear. Tell us about what the atmosphere is like when this bill is being debated. Some of the public think there's an inbuilt Tory majority in the Lords, but it's not like that these days, is it?
No, it's not like that. I mean, on some parts of the bill, the Liberal Democrats are working alongside us, but not on all of it. But there's nothing like that. And of course, in the last intake in the Lords, Keir Starmer appointed a number of former trade union leaders, and Corbyn had done that before him. So the agenda is very plain to see, and the atmosphere is tense, but we're all terribly polite to each other. But on this bill, there's a sense of bloody-minded determination and very little debate. So it's a lot of very hard-working peers from the crossbenches, Liberal Democrat benches, the Tory benches, plugging away with, amendments and seeing very little by way of engagement on the other side.
And isn't it the reality, Joanne, that however much you and your colleagues try and amend this bill, in the end, Labour will get their way. It will come back to the Commons, yes, and your amendments will be reversed. So isn't it the case that this bill is going to end up being law pretty much in the same form that the government wants it to be?
Yes, that's right. So there's a convention in this country that the Lords can amend bills and seek to debate them, which is what we're trying to do at the moment. But there's a convention that if a party has been elected with a majority on a manifesto pledge, that has to go through. So we can do everything possible to change parts of it and seek to engage the other side in debate and plead with them to see reason on some of it. But that's not happening. We're not seeing any concession. And actually, what's extraordinary to me, Liam, is if the economy was currently growing and employment was, tickety-boo and all of that, I would understand it more. But when, you look at sickness benefits, you look at the unemployment rates starting to really bump up month by month, that worries me, because you think there's sort of a detachment from the reality of people's lives that's going on here. And I think people will be very unforgiving, and they're guaranteed to do more damage to the economy.
Joanne Cash, Baroness Cash, thanks a lot for joining us on Planet Normal. Well, there you have it, Allison. Very comprehensive summary there by Joanne Cash. I do think now we are getting a bit of media play on this bill. I've been writing about it in my column, link in the show notes to this episode. The Daily Mail's now talking about it a lot, as well as Telegraph reporters too. I am really concerned about this legislation, that it's going to kill the economy stone dead, and employment. We've already seen a huge drop of employment under Labour over the last 6 months.
Well, I think Baroness Cash is our kind of gal, isn't she, really? She's an absolute citizen of Planet Normal. Apart from reading you, Liam, I just haven't really picked up on how disastrous half of this stuff is. I mean, clearly the sort of blatant scam element of getting people to donate to Labour's coffers, absolutely extraordinary. But also in the kind of interstices of these changes are things like menopause care, committing businesses to providing God knows what. You can imagine your average hairdressing salon, if 5 of the girls are off on maternity leave and 3 of them are wanting, sort of special air conditioning units for the menopause. I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not really joking, am I? Because all the businesses, the small businesses I know in our town, are really back up against the wall now. So a lot of this stuff is not just frivolous and beside the point when businesses need to be growing and employing people, but is absolutely disastrous. And as you said brilliantly, Liam, earlier on, it's all very well getting extra rights for workers when there aren't going to be very many workers, because they're all going to be out of a job, aren't they? And can I just say that, apart from Joanne Cash's apparently not thinking I am the leading economist on this podcast.
An outrage.
Outrageous. Honestly, where's a sisterly solidarity? But yeah, I think she was really confirming your diagnosis, with which, by the way, I agree, and indeed have a post-it note stuck to my screen with it written on.
There is no higher praise from La Pearson.
I know, Pearson post-it note.
La post-it note, c'est moi.
This one says Labour just don't care. They know they don't represent the country, but they're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And it's very interesting, isn't it? Because we haven't even had the first anniversary of this government yet, have we? And yet it feels like really feels like the end of days. So I think it's very interesting to see how it can possibly go on. I mean, I don't know whether there's going to be some financial crisis, but I just don't see, with them defying the will of the country, plus enacting, as you've said, extreme Corbynite policies really now, aren't they? The Blairites seem to be marginalised.
I should say, Alison, some of our excellent colleagues on The Telegraph, particularly Lucy Burton, our employment editor, has been writing about this, but it's tended to be a business pages story. Now it's suddenly breaking in to the main sections of newspapers, and even television can't ignore it now, this employment rights bill. And something else is happening. Business leaders who, not the sort of entrepreneurial, small and medium-sized business leaders who employ 2/3 of the country. I'm talking about the sort of the corporate politician business leaders, the people that start their life at McKinsey and then waft between various top jobs in industry, running listed companies, sort of failing upwards. They are now realising, even though they were absolutely besotted by Keir Starmer when he came in, that basically he doesn't know what he's doing when it comes to business. There's no one on the front bench that knows what they're doing. In stark contrast, I would say, to the Tony Blair, Gordon Brown era. And I'm totally willing to defend this view. Some people would disagree with it. But there were people at the top of the Blair government who really understood business, who really understood financial markets. And there are absolutely none now at the top of this Labour government. And you're getting the sort of CBI types. They're finally realising, you start opposing because the people who you've been bigging up for the last 3 years because you hate the Tories so much are really making a mess. And we're starting to see that now. And Andrew Griffith, who I think is a very perceptive politician, the Tories' shadow business secretary, he's playing his cards well, I think. He is making an impact. By writing that letter to business leaders, which did make a splash in the newspaper, saying, look, folks, this is really bad. We can't oppose this on our own. You have to start opposing it too. And that is now happening. And that's adding to that feeling that even though we're only a year into this parliament, it at least feels like the end of days. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
We've had many emails, of course, about Lucy Connelly and her treatment. But this is an amazing email from Jenny, not her real name, for reasons that will become apparent. Dear Allison and Liam, reading about Lucy Connelly and her imprisonment at Drake Hall keeps reminding me of my own time there. I thought I would write about it now, having never done so before. It was nearly 25 years ago, says Jenny, when I was so young and naive that I pled guilty to a crime I did not believe I was guilty of. I had to get back to work that day, and with a massive case of hindsight, I should have proceeded with the trial that was planned. The upshot was that, like Lucy, I got an unexpected sentence in my case of 18 months. I spent my sentence in Drake Hall in Staffordshire, where Lucy was. I was very shocked and resentful of the sentence, but obviously just got my head down and did the time. I was young enough to appreciate the freedom of being in prison, not having to worry about anything. My work was waiting for me when I got out, and in a funny way, it was a very welcome break from society. Unfortunately, during my time in Drake Hall, I made friends with groups of people that I might not normally associate with. I didn't fully understand why they led their chaotic lives or anything about drug addiction, but it was certainly a more interesting lifestyle to me. I couldn't get back into a work regime. I didn't really want to. My resentment against the state was a massive driving force behind a desire to sod society. Why work, says Jenny. I'd rather sit under the arches with my mates. And in that sort of dropout lifestyle, everyone in the same situation was a mate, like a ready-made community. So I began a path of drug taking and ended up rough sleeping. I was a heroin and crack cocaine user. I had a very expensive habit. To fund my habit and to survive on the streets, I did commit crimes, and I was sent back to prison 6 times over the next 5 years. I did not hurt anyone in this time, only myself. Being sent to prison those times was fine by me. I was guilty of what I was accused of, and going back to prison was always a bit of respite from life on the streets. I had no fear of prison. My friends were there. It was a bit like being at boarding school, but being old enough to appreciate it. Not sure whether I just told myself that or not. I'm an optimistic sort and try to look on the bright side. In between prison and rough sleeping, says Jenny, I stayed in a couple of homeless hostels for a short time. I'm still genuinely angry over what I saw there. I felt that the young girls at the hostel were more like a scheme to get housing benefit from the council instead of offering any help. One night, this young woman arrived back home, quote unquote, to the hostel, but she had failed to get her benefit form stamped. This meant the hostel wouldn't get paid for having her, so they wouldn't allow her in. She had nowhere to go, and she was murdered on the streets that night. That was a Salvation Army hostel, and I couldn't tell you how much I detest them. Details of her murder are online, but it was never reported that she was turned away because of a piece of paper. During my last sentence, Jenny says something changed. I turned 30 years old and I didn't want to still be living on the streets at 40, but what could I do? I had no idea. All the fun had suddenly gone. The drug addiction workers who came to see us in prison were not much help, not to me anyway. I was telling one of them about my epiphany and how I needed to change, and she said, "You can't do it on your own." This enraged me. Of course I could. The only solution to my situation was one under my complete control. The thought of getting out of prison and restarting my life grew and grew within me. It soon occupied all my thoughts daily. Beforehand, I would just think of how quickly I could spend my discharge grant on drugs and start the cycle again. This time was completely different. I promised that I would give it one shot and give it my best shot at that and see what happened. So I did. I have friends who I left behind over the years. I've contacted them and tried to bring them back into society, but they've been prescribed methadone and left on a maintenance script for all these years. They have no chance of employment or any sort of gainful life. They live to visit the chemist each day and take 30 ml of methadone in front of the dispenser. If they were on a tapering script to reduce the usage, then they would have been free from the drugs years ago. It's a criminal waste of life, but the people who work in these drug agencies need to keep themselves in employment somehow. And I am now in my 50s, says Jenny. I have my own house, nice car. I own a business that employs 8 people. I don't mean to boast, but my business has a 7-figure turnover. No, I take that back. I do mean to boast. When I think back to where I came from, I do feel a little satisfied. No one I work with knows about my past. I don't tell anyone. This is because I think it's shameful, and I don't feel like I did a thing. I think that I let myself down greatly. Jenny.
Powerful email there from Jenny, and many congratulations, Jenny, on your business success and on rebuilding your life so superbly well. This is from David. Dear Allison and Liam, thanks for your weekly dose of sanity that gives us hope that one day this madness may end. I was dismayed by the ease at which vandals were able to vandalise warplanes, then make their getaway at RAF Bryce Norton. I wondered who might be in charge of such an important military establishment, so I visited the RAF's website. The following may sound like a parody, but it is an unedited quotation. Group Captain Louise Henton, OBE, ADC, BA ONS, MA, RAF. Group Captain Louise Henton joined the RAF in 2001 and took command of RAF Bryce Norton in July 2024. She served at RAF stations in the UK and completed worldwide deployments and detachments. Louise has completed command and staff appointments in personnel, media, recruitment programs and plans and human resources. Promoted to Group Captain in August 2022, she was recently responsible for delivery of the modernisation of career management practices and protocol. So we have Rachel from Accounts funding the RAF, says David, and Louise from Personnel running the RAF's largest base. China, Iran and Russia are laughing at us. And I guess David's point, Allison, is that we have somebody running a hugely sensitive facility who's had no military experience whatsoever.
Yeah. More fruits of diversity, equity and inclusion. We've had lots of great emails about this decriminalisation of abortion up till full term. Dr. Kevin says, as an obstetrician working in the NHS several decades ago, I recall that we abandoned the practice of ultrasound scanning of the unborn at 6 to 8 weeks gestation and delayed it to after 20 weeks beyond the legal limit for termination of pregnancy. This was because it was known to be facilitating the practice of sex-selective abortion, in which the female unborn was selected for termination of pregnancy by those who considered a male child to be more valuable. Quotes. It must surely be the case that such sex-selective abortion will now re-emerge within the UK with any proposed change in the law, such as agreed by our MPs in such haste in recent days. And Jane shares Dr. Kevin's concern. Dear Allison and Liam, says Jane, another brilliant episode, thank you. Sammy Woodhouse's interview brought tears to my eyes. The collusion between the officials, the police, the families is shocking. You briefly mentioned that the change to the abortion law may result in sex-selective abortions being carried out. By coincidence, says Jane, I've been looking up the statistics on male-female birth ratios just before I listened to Planet Normal. There is evidence from the ONS data that sex-selective abortions may already be happening in the UK. And guess what? It's female fetuses that are being aborted. The ONS looked at births by ethnicity in the UK between 2017 and 2021. There were 3.6 million births registered in the UK in this period, with a ratio of males to females of 105.4. If the birth ratio goes above 107, alarm bells ring. Something is definitely going on. The data revealed a ratio of 113 males to 100 female babies born to mothers of Asian heritage, where the mother already had 2 children. This indicates that sex-selective abortions of babies are being conducted, and that up to 400 female fetuses may have been aborted because of their sex over the time period studied. This raises so many questions about abortion laws in this country. Not only do we now have abortion to term, but we also facilitate sex-selective abortions. Thanks again, says Jane, for everything you do.
And on that bombshell, and that is a bombshell, isn't it, Allison? It's exactly what we were discussing last week. On that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week. It's my turn, and it has to go to Jenny among some really powerful emails. Jenny, again, chapeau to you, the way you've turned your life around, and good on you for writing to us here at Planet Normal. So send us an email at planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, put Mugwort in the subject heading, give us your postal address, and we will send you one of those rare as rocking horse poo Planet Normal mugs.
Jenny, I'd really like you to meet Lucy Connelly when she comes out. I'm sure your matching experiences, I think you'd be a tremendous inspiration to her. Aren't we lucky, Liam, having all these brilliant, well-informed listeners sharing their rich life experiences with us? So please do subscribe to this podcast, leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, so it will help the Planet Normal family to grow.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers Cass Ho, James Hodgson and Louisa Wells. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.